Hello everyone, Robman here again. This week I'm going to be doing a brief port review of the Pommern. I found that the new setup for the videos where I separate out the gameplay example and the port review works a lot better, specifically to keep the times of the videos down. I find two 15-minute videos is better than a single 30-minute, so I think I'll be sticking with that format going forward. If you have any feedback for that, please leave it in the comments. Beyond that, let's get into the port review of the Pommern. Now this ship, you can see I do run Lucians on it. Just to preface it with that, this is definitely a strong secondary battleship. I'll start off with the armor layout. You can see this ship definitely prefers to be as close in as possible. It has a small 32mm area on the bow, a little bit on the top, and a little bit more on the front of the hull, though it does have a massive 60mm icebreaker with a 150mm icebreaker behind that. Now that's both good and bad. The good being when you're pointing the ship at someone like this or like this, the shells will very commonly bounce off that. The downside being when you present more like this, the shells, whereas normally on like an American battleship might overpen, here they will most definitely pen. That is more than enough to arm the shells, and the ship is thick enough at that point where they will detonate within the ship and they will do full pen damage. So that is sort of a double-edged sword, so make sure that you are angling the ship properly during an approach. Beyond that, the side of the ship, it's your classic German armoring scheme, 38mm side torpedo protection underwater. The entire side belt is about 300mm until you get to this mid belt, which is 235, and above that it's 145. So once again, if you're angling like this, you're going to bounce a lot of shells. Almost nothing can go through. If you start to give this type of angle, a lot of things now are going to start going through, and the closer and closer to the broadside you give, the better and more consistent their salvos are going to be. They will pen and they will do full damage to this ship. You can see in the back, the same deal as up front, a 90mm rear armor belt, so the good part of that is that shells very rarely damage your steering gear. The downside is that they all deal pen damage. Beyond that, you have your standard 32mm armor belt. In terms of deck armor, you'll see just behind the 32mm both bow and stern you have a 50mm section. You also have a 50mm section throughout the entire center of the ship. Around the main battery turrets is actually 80mm. This is very similar to the armor found on the Friedrich der Grosse, or the Tech Tree Tier 9 ship. You can see that it is very similar. Beyond that, the superstructure is your standard Battleship 19mm at this tier. And the Pommern does also possess your standard German turtleback. You can see under here, the turtleback is quite well angled, and it's 150mm thick, and it does extend below the waterline at a very, very steep angle. So anything within 12 kilometers, short of a very, very lucky shot, it is highly unlikely that anything is going to be able to penetrate you. So, what that means is this ship very much prefers to be close in, brawling, which is just as well because the guns are your standard German 380mm guns, the same ones found on the Bismarck, with the exception that you have 12 of them. Now these guns, just like on the Bismarck, are absolutely terrible at anything outside point-blank range, but once you close to within about 12 kilometers, 13 kilometers, they become much more usable. This combined with a secondary range with a full secondary build of 12 kilometers, along with 6-kilometer torpedoes, which I'll get into in a little bit, this ship is very, very strong in a close-in engagement. In terms of the main battery itself, you have a 33-second reload, which is a little long, but nothing too crazy. An excellent 180-degree turn time with my build of just under 29 seconds. The maximum dispersion appears to be acceptable, but this ship does have a very, very low Sigma rating, which is the reason that you will sometimes see this ship shotgunning shells at long range. This is by no means a sniper, despite the acceptable range of 21 kilometers. I don't fire the HE very often at all. I find the 15-inch gun's penetration is usually more than adequate, but in the event you need to fire it, it is your standard German HE with a terrible fire chance, but excellent pen as a trade-off. The 118mm of penetration, as you can see by the armor profile that I just went over, just about anywhere except for the main armor belt, those HE shells will pen on this ship. So if you do need to fire the HE, you can fire it just about anywhere, just don't aim for turrets or armor belts. It is also possible with that level of pen to citadel a number of the cruisers in this game, including especially some of the tier 10 light cruisers, like a Minotaur if you happen to have it loaded. The velocity of the shells is also fantastic at 820 meters per second. It does not take particularly long for the shells to get there, especially at closer range. In terms of a secondary armament, you have two different types. You have the 105mm guns, which I choose to run IFHE to make them a little bit more effective. You can see these mounted here, 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 and here on both sides. You have 4 mounts per side of 2 guns. You also have 3 mounts per side of 2 guns of the 150mm. The 105s have a fire chance of 3.5%. Like I said, I do run IFHE to get that armor penetration value up to 32mm. The 150s, unfortunately, also suffer because of IFHE. They don't need it, but in order for the 105s to be effective, you are obligated on this ship to take the skill unless you want to be a fire starter. But with IFHE, these only have a 5% chance of fire. This ship is by no means a fire starter with the secondaries, although it should be noted that particularly with the 105s, the fire rate is absolutely fantastic at 2.3 seconds, so you will still get a fair number. It's just not the ship's specialty. Beyond that, if someone is brave enough to come well within secondary range and they try to YOLO you, if there's a destroyer that pops up or anything along those lines, you also have 8 533mm torpedo tubes. That is 4 per side. They are mounted midships and actually have a pretty good firing arc of about here to here. If you have a Tirpitz, you'll know what I'm talking about. Beyond that, they have a 6-kilometer range and a speed of 64 knots with my build, and they reload in 90 seconds, so only a minute and a half. The damage is a little low at 13,700, but it's more than enough to deter cruisers and destroyers, or if you need to finish off an enemy battleship at close range, they are also very good for doing that. You have your standard German airstrike with 2 attack flights. I won't go too far into that. Beyond that, you also have your AA defenses. They are your standard German AA with the 30mm guns. They are really generally not very good, and you generally don't stop anything with this ship, as is to be expected from battleships in this game. If a carrier wants to strike you, it absolutely will, and I won't go too far into it beyond noting that the number of explosions that you do generate is decent on this ship just by virtue of the fact that you do have a secondary build on it. So while your base AA is substantially lower than this, the ship can, for a time, defend itself against tier 8 carriers and things like that. I would not take potluck against tier 10s in this ship, even with a secondary build. You can also see the lackluster German firing range of only 5.2 kilometers. So what that means is, particularly in the case of torpedo bombers, by the time they drop their torpedoes, they are generally barely within your range. Therefore, if there is a CV in the game, I strongly recommend hanging around your friendly cruisers, especially during the start of the match, just to avoid tanking the early chip damage that this ship definitely takes. The maneuverability, I do run speed flag, as I do with most of my ships. 32.6 knots is pretty fantastic at this tier. A relatively poor 940 meter turning circle radius, as well as a rudder shift time of 17.3 seconds. Now that is not very good. It's actually downright terrible compared to a lot of the other battleships at this tier. But for a ship of this size, it is to be expected. It is nothing different. And as I said, you should generally, beyond your normal zigzags to avoid torpedoes, you generally want to find a decent secondary angle, usually about here, where the ship is able to fire both front guns, get the front half of your secondary guns on target. You can see at about this angle you will have 2 mounts of the 105 and 2 mounts of the 150 on target. If you try to get the rest on target, you do wind up having to show broadside. It should be noted that the turrets on this ship also have notoriously poor firing angles. I do not recommend getting all 4 turrets on target, or trying to, if you're under heavy fire, as that will open this ship up to taking a substantial amount of counterfire, and that counterfire will generally pen, given the angle that you have to give. Beyond that, concealment, because this is a secondary build, I am not running a full concealment build, so I will be detected at 15 kilometers. But given that this is a full concealment build, that's only a 3-kilometer gap that you need to cross before your secondary guns come into play, which is more than acceptable in my book for the way that this ship is played. Beyond that, there's not too much more to go over the ship. I will, once again, as usual, have a gameplay review going up later today showing exactly how to play this ship. I specifically chose the game not because it is a particularly amazing game, but you can see how much damage these secondaries will put out in a very short period of time. And that's down partially to the build that I have, also partially to the unique skill of Gunther Luchins. Now, before I polish off this video, I will go over briefly the build. The build should be fairly straightforward for anyone who's played this game for any period of time. It's the standard German secondary build. So I run Auxiliary Armaments Mod 1 to prevent the secondary battery mounts from being destroyed. That also, as a side note, helps your AA mount survivability, which means that although the AA defense is not great to begin with, you tend to hang on to quite a bit of it through the end of the match. I also run Damage Control Systems Mod 1 just because this is a brawling ship, so you do tend to get set on fire and have torpedoes fired at you quite often. I also do not find that my engine or steering gear gets knocked out fairly often, as this is a rather large battleship. I also run the Secondary Battery Mod 1 in the third slot, fairly standard, better main battery firing range and better dispersion. For the same reason as slot 2, I run the Damage Control Systems Mod 2. You may choose to run steering gears, given that this is a brawling battleship, but I find that with the proper amount of distance and respect given to enemy destroyers, I find that this build works just a little bit better for my tastes and how I play. I do run the Concealment Systems Mod 1 just to mitigate the distance that I have to cross between when I'm detected and when my secondaries come into play. It is also very valuable to run either the Torpedo Lookout System or Ship Consumables Mod 1. If you don't particularly care about the detectability, or you feel that you could play this better around islands, the Torpedo Lookout System is also a very, very good option for this ship. Although it should be noted, not strictly necessary because this ship does have hydroacoustic search, as with many of the other German battleships. And then for the last slot, I do run Auxiliary Armaments Mod 2, once again, part of the standard secondary build, just for better reload time, and once again, this does help your AA out a little bit, so all those benefits are appreciated. You have your standard set of armaments, standard HE and AP, as well as the torpedoes that I went over earlier. Consumable-wise, you have a repair party, a heal, and a hydroacoustic search. No option to take a plane or anything like that, and no option to take any DFAA or anything like that. This is not a cruiser. In terms of a commander build, I run Demolition Expert, just to get the fire chance of the secondaries to an acceptable level. Because this is a brawling battleship, I take Grease the Gears, which does get a small bonus because this is Luchins. IFHE, as I mentioned before, you need that in order to make your 105mm guns able to pen 32mm. I also choose to run Priority Target, just so I know how many enemies are paying attention. As I said, the way that I play this ship is I like to pop up in unexpected locations and absolutely pummel what I find. And having Priority Target lets me know that I should turn around if I see too many enemies noticing me or focusing me down. This ship is very good at angling against one or two targets, but once they get you in a crossfire, this ship will die very, very quickly. Beyond that, I run the standard secondary builds, skills, long-range secondary battery shells, and manual secondary battery aiming. Both of these skills are mandatory for any serious secondary build. I also run Adrenaline Rush just to get the reload down. Because this is a frontline battleship, AR is extremely valuable, especially as the game drags on. It just makes everything more effective. And for the same reason I want more heals, I do run Emergency Repair Expert. You may, if you were to change this build, you may want to change out Emergency Repair Expert for Fire Prevention Expert. That depends entirely on what equipment you choose. If you choose to run equipment where you get set on fire more often, this may be a preferable skill, just in the interest of preserving your hit points. This is the build I choose to run. There are several others that are valid for this ship, but as a general rule, anything that helps out your long-term survivability and your secondary battery is what you're going to want to run on this ship. With that said, this has been Robman, and this is my port review of the German Tier 9 battleship, the Pommern. If you have a specific ship you'd like me to cover in the future, please leave that in the comments below, and I'll see what I can do. In the coming days, I will be releasing a short video detailing exactly what ships I have in my port, just so that everyone is aware of what ships I'm able to review and which ones will take some time for me to acquire. Just as a general rule going forward, I am generally a battleship and a cruiser player. I do have a number of destroyers, but I am generally not as skilled in them as I am in my battleships. With that said, this has been Robman, and this has been my Pommern review.